Okay, so what am I going to talk about? What I want to do here is talk about how this basic shift, and if you follow the headlines, there has been a broad stroke shift from America saying Europe to Asia, right? I mean, you probably all picked up on that if you've been following some of this. So what I want to do is explain why that came about, what the implications are globally and for Europe, and then fit that into some of the discussion of the Eurozone crisis to a degree. And I'll try to keep it, like I said, brief and rather general, and then we can dig in on the details in the Q&A. So basically, the U.S. did a mini strategy review late last year. And the reason they did that, and again, I'm just an academic, all I'm giving you is my perspective. I do get good at, I think I'm pretty well briefed on these things, but I certainly only speak for myself, so, take it for a grain of salt. But I think that the reason they did this was because the last time they did a major legally required, what's called the Quadrennial Defense Review, which I actually spoke about a bit here last time I was here, it was really done in the absence of strategy and an absence of a serious review. It sort of like wish listed the things we want to keep doing in our defense budget and defense planning. But it was almost completely absent any calculation or thinking through the implications of the global financial crisis and the economic crisis. And so it had, things in there like we still have to have 400,000 troops for permanent deployment, rotational deployment, and things like that, but it never really said why. And it really thought carefully about how we're going to empower partners around the world to help us better accomplish things that maybe can be done in a way where America doesn't always have to be there. And as you'll see, I'm going to lead up to a large point there about Europe and where I think this is headed. So there was a need to reassess, basically, America's relative position in the world and how that affects our budgets, right? Because we're having the same issues there, and when we talk about austerity and cuts, as you well know. So there are three quotes, I think, that really are significant here that set up the political context here. You had the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mike Mullen, former chair, and Hillary Clinton, the Secretary of State, say that the number one national security threat to the United States of America is the debt, the more than $14 trillion debt that we have. But then they don't stand up and say, and here's what we should cut in defense to help fix that. And we are now having adopted a very unuseful kind of thing of being stuck on, we can't cut benefits, we can't raise taxes, and we used to be cutting defense was not something we talked about, but now it is in a big way. So they're starting to look for major savings in defense spending. And so that's changed. The second key quote came, actually, the next two come from former Secretary of Defense Robert Gates. He said two things that were crucial. About a year ago, in January, he said, any president who thinks that the United States should be fighting a ground war in Asia or the Middle East should have their head examined. That was his direct quote. Well, then why do you need such a big army if you're not going to fight ground wars in the places where you might likely need to do it? And that really set a change of tone for thinking about our relative priorities. The third key quote also came from Secretary Gates, who said that if Europe did not begin to pick up the slack on spending, that NATO would face a dim or dismal future. Now the problem was that was a kind of thing Secretary of Defenses have been saying for since NATO was born, more or less. And it was the main point of my talk last time, so I won't go over that again. But the main thing that's relevant there is that he said that, but there wasn't a lot of follow-through on, okay, well, what do we need to do to change the incentive basis? It's one thing to ask Europeans to do more, and that feeds into the American domestic political debate, but what are we actually going to do to say to the Europeans, you need to do more because guess what? We're not going to be there to do it for you. And that is where, as you'll see, I believe this is headed. For the social scientists in the room, this fits, in my view, very nicely with a classic piece of literature by a guy named Robert Gilpin, who talks about how countries get overstretched and overburdened, and they spend too much time having to spend on protecting the periphery of their interests, and they get bogged down in peripheral wars, and they spend money on that, and that overconsumes the relative cost of investing in the things that made them powerful in the first place, like in our case today, our education system, our domestic economy, the debt, and things like that. So America got overstretched. And you see that clearly now in Afghanistan, a completely unwinnable war, which we probably should have not surged into in 2009. I think most people, if they could do that one over again, they might have rethought that. But we are where we are, and we can talk about that one a little later. But great powers have choices. They can continue to spend and get bogged down in peripheral interests, or they can retrench. And America is at a point where it must retrench. It has had, if you think about it, a near constant tempo of military activity since the end of the Cold War. In Panama in 1989-88, the first Persian Gulf War, dual containment, Iran-Iraq, air power basically going all throughout the 1990s, the Balkans, obviously the invasion of Iraq, Afghanistan. This is a very high operational tempo for the military to take, and so you've got people in the U.S. Armed Forces that have, as you well know, done fourth, fifth tours of duty now into Afghanistan. I have a former student who's been there, I think, 3 or 4 times now. That's tough. That's tough. And that takes a toll on your capabilities and so forth. The other issue that's driving this is that America's public is very tired. So there's a cultural shift. No longer is it like a sacred ground to talk about the defense budget, because people, you got the Tea Party on one side who want to cut everything, sorry, including that microphone. They want to cut virtually everything they can, including defense. And then you have Democrats that often have wanted to cut defense. And you just have basic fiscal conservatives who say, yes, we must cut everything, virtually. And so the question is, at what expense and how do you go about doing it? But you have a good poll number from Pew gives you a sense. Only 39% of Americans in the poll they released about a month or two ago say that Americans should, quote, help other countries. And 52% said Americans should take care of their own problems and let others get by as best they can. That's actually, in terms of that polling data, a very significant change from just 4 or 5 years ago. And it really reflects, I think, the tired nature of these wars that we've been in and the impact it's had. On the other hand, you have people like Mitt Romney running for president who's saying, we have to stay till we win in Afghanistan. He wants to increase the size of the army by 100,000. He doesn't tell you why, but he wants to increase it. Maybe it's a Keynesian jobs plan. I have no idea what that is. But at the end of the day, Obama has been criticized now as being sort of defeatist, and there's sort of a declinism going on. But when you step back, I have a friend named Michael Cohen who writes a blog at foreignpolicy.com, and he makes a really good point. America is the safest great power in the history of great powers. There is virtually no conventional threat to our country that you can really think of. I mean, nuclear war, sure, whatever, but those kind of existential things are gone. And we spend a lot of time, like a big elephant, being chased around by a mouse. And Americans actually can look at polls like by psychologists. They say they're the most, like we don't sleep well at night, we're sort of paranoid, we sort of see these things that are out there, these threats, and so forth. But when you really step back, Americans have it pretty darn good, and they're doing pretty well. And at the end of the day, they're very safe, and probably one of the most secure nations that have ever risen to the position that they have. So all those things kind of come together to contribute and combine with the economic crisis, and the fact that most of the real threats that are out there are not military in nature. They're primarily civilian and indeed economic in that regard. The stability of societies are really challenged by economic issues at this stage, as everyone here well knows. So that all leads to a basic issue of that America can and should retrench. And if you look at this new guidance that came out of the Defense Department in January, and you can read it online, and I won't bore you with it, but basically it shifts America's strategic eye from Europe and the Middle East to Asia. That's the bane. Now, it doesn't tell you how we're going to do it, how much we're going to cut and whatnot, and redeploy and so forth, but it sets the tone for how planning then would come forward in terms of budgets and procurement and so forth. And it starts a discussion on what is going to be needed when we do have left both Iraq and Afghanistan. It moves very far away from this idea of counterinsurgency warfare, which just a couple years ago was sort of the hot thing that everyone was doing, and now it's like, well, maybe we won't do that again. I mean, that's at the core of Secretary Gates's quote. And it goes through a list of things that are threats and so forth and so on. The real dilemma is actually, and here's the problem, this becomes political, it's still very ambitious about what America should be doing in the world, but it wants to do it with less, right? And we all know, doing more with less is a big part of the dogma now. But that's an unfair thing to ask a soldier to do. When they're putting their lives on the line for your nation, you want them to be as equipped and capable as they need to be. But we still have an impulse to also get involved in wars. I mean, we just fought a war in Libya just a year ago. And I have to say, we barely succeeded in that war. We got lucky at the end. And I'm going to come back to it in just a minute. Now you have a lot of Americans that are saying we should intervene in Syria. I don't know how they would possibly intervene in Syria, but they want to. So there's a natural impulse to kind of want to do good things, to be on the right side of history, and so forth and so on. But the military component of that, at the end of the day, in fact, it was Steve Walt who spoke here a year ago, said that really what this is a political document that sets the tone for future discussion with regard to cuts. And in addition to rethinking about about Asia, it also opens up for what I want to talk about next, which is a major discussion of Europe. And I just kind of stick with this point for a few minutes here. So there's three key elements of this new strategy, which lead me to tell you that I think it is fair to anticipate dramatic and I think highly appropriate changes in America's role in European security. And when I say dramatic, I'm not talking about just a couple brigades or small movements of troops. We have 80,000 or so plus troops in Europe right now. I'm going to tell you that I think it's very possible that within a few years we're down to 20,000 troops in Europe. I can imagine a scenario where we're down to the low thousands of troops in Europe. And I would support that scenario, and I would endorse it here today. I think it's the right move, and I want to tell you why I think it's the right move, and then you can all tell me why I'm wrong. The first, it comes out, though, in kind of a deductive logic of what they're saying in this new defense strategy. There's three key points here. The first is the one I mentioned. Asia is now the priority. Okay, China, obviously, is the key word there. The second thing is they want to cut the size of the army from 570,000 to as low as 490,000. And I have lots of statistics, but I'll leave most of that out here. But to give you a sense of the cuts, that's actually, they could cut a lot more, I think. But that's about 80,000 or so troops, and I just told you there's 80,000 or so troops available in Europe. And people say, well, it costs to decommission them, it costs to redeploy them. I said, no, that's not what we're going to do. We're going to lower the size of the army. And if you look around the world and you think, where is the place where there is security, there is stability? As I said last time I was here, we won. Europe is whole and free. It's safe. It's secure. It has challenges. But because the security problem is the economic problem, that is where governments are going to have to focus for a decade or so here. And we have considerable opportunity here to realign this relationship in ways that would be mutually advantaging to both sides of the transatlantic relationship. But the reality is, you can't do everything else that's in the defense planning document unless you withdraw U.S. troops from Europe. I'm not talking about all of them. I'm not talking about leaving NATO. In fact, a big shift that would change for me is I used to say we should be pressing the EU to get into this area more. I don't say that anymore. This has to be done through NATO, I believe. That's a change, and Ben and I would argue about that, I'm sure. But that is a shift for me personally, and I'd be glad to expand on that later. The third key point is the document says, whenever possible, we will develop innovative, low-cost, and small-footprint approaches to achieve our security objectives. The reliance would be on exercises, rotational presence, and advising, in effect. And so if you look around the world, and you ask a basic question, here we are 60 years after World War II, 20-plus years after the Cold War. If there's any place, if we can't disengage from Europe, where in the world can we with our military? It's safe, it's secure. We can do this. On the other hand, we can't just walk away from our allies. So the challenge is to create new incentives, not to get Europe to spend more on defense, because clearly anyone who understands the Eurozone crisis knows there will not be more money spent on defense in Europe. It's going to be cut, if anything. So the challenge is, how do we work over the next 3 to 5 years to rationalize, and at the core of my argument is that by creating the right incentive bases, the European allies, and I mean the big ones, will have more incentive to rationalize and multilateralize their own defense planning without the United States. And we should be helping them with that and encouraging them with that. Now, I have to say, that's actually, I think, a dominant position now in Washington. 5 years ago, that was a red line that you could not cross. You don't duplicate capabilities. You don't put Europe out front. You've got to protect the American integrative command architecture in NATO. That has, I believe, changed dramatically. And I hear it when I talk to people off the record in the government, and it's certainly my view. So this is where you hear new catchphrases like smart defense and things like that, you know, sort of new integrative capacities. We can come back and talk about that again in a bit. But the idea of being to better pool and share specialized capabilities to meet the new challenges of the 21st century. But at the end of the day, you're not going to need 80,000 US troops to do that, okay? And obviously, a lot of this is getting back to the question of the burden sharing argument about NATO, and this really did really get finalized, I think, and crystallized in 2 key recent wars. The first being Afghanistan, where I think the Obama administration came in really thinking that, you know, well, we're not George Bush, and so the European allies will be happy to send more troops to Afghanistan because we're the Obama administration. And they found out very quickly that actually these European allies just have interests and they see things differently than we do, and it didn't really happen. That upset people, I think. It changed people's view a little bit about how we thought about that transatlantic commitment. But Libya was significant too. Many Americans saw a kind of dubious rationale for the war there. They felt drawn into the war by the British and the French in ways that they might not have wanted to. So we have this new model, right? Hear the phrase, lead from behind. And Obama was criticized for that. But to a degree it worked. But if you actually look at it, you had 6 countries at war in an alliance of, 29 now or so. You've got no actual agreement on the mission. Was it humanitarian? Was it regime change? NATO could not operate without the key staging, logistical, or intelligence assets that only America could provide. There was no real plan B other than what they were doing all along. And these are some in the weeds things, but it's kind of worth pointing out. The Allies lacked the aircraft and capacity and precision-guided weaponry, sustainability of air operations. All the planes that were used were U.S.-made and all U.S. dependent on U.S. operating systems. And even after the U.S. kind of led from behind and handed off, we still flew about 25% of the air operations, and that included the intelligence, the jamming of frequencies, and refueling. The U.K., the next most capable country here, used 20% of their cruise missile capacity in the first 3 weeks of the war. That's for their total national capacity, right? So this needs to be fixed. And really what happened was, you know, a lot of, I believe, and I'm not speaking for them, but I believe a lot of American defense planners looked at that and thought, this was not a vital interest to America, this war. It was an allied interest, and we were happy to support it. But this kind of dysfunctional alliance at the military level cannot be sustained. It will break. And that was what Secretary of Defense Gates was warning about. So I want to start to actually move to conclude here, because I'm just like laying out a general argument, and then we can dig in. But so I'd make a couple key points here about how to realign and what I think would be the next steps here. And this is what I've been arguing in op-ed pieces and in talks in Europe and in the United States. So to restate, we really can't do our new strategic plan without major cuts, and I don't mean just at the margins, but major cuts in Europe. And so I believe this is coming. There is no actual functional reason why the European members of NATO cannot be uniquely responsible for security matters in their own peripheral area. The capabilities are there. They're not used well. There's a lot of redundancy. Or duplication, I should say, within Europe. It's not effective and efficient in that regard, obviously. But even beyond the peripheral concerns of Europe, you know, Europe is at peace, and despite the economic crisis, remains among the wealthiest and most economically advantaged regions in the world. An additional point is that we do see already good things happening in terms of European efforts to consolidate capabilities without the United States. The British and the French, you might have noticed, are now sharing considerable information on nuclear planning, on aircraft carriers, on intelligence, at a level that they were never able to accomplish during the Cold War. And why are they doing it? Well, Prime Minister Cameron was very specific. We're doing this to economize and save money. And what's interesting about that is you think about the nature of the Eurozone crisis, and one of the real dangers would be sort of nationalism or renationalization, and people say, like, America must stay in Europe because the historical forces of renationalization of militaries would leave if America wasn't there in NATO. And I would understand that concern. It's a very legitimate one. But it's not an excuse for maintaining a dysfunctional architecture. Moreover, I would argue that we have a strategic calm period in Europe, at least at the militarily level, where we can afford to work this issue differently. And in particular, we can basically test the proposition that Europe will be more incentivized. They're not going to increase defense budgets, but they would be more incentivized to rationalize and integrate their capabilities like the British and French are doing, like the Germans and Poles have been doing, like the Germans and French have been doing, in ways that will actually produce better capabilities without the United States necessarily having to be involved. And my proof in my point is Radek Sikorski, who's a very good thinker, I think, and a very pro-American minister out of Poland. But you may have seen that he gave a speech in November in Berlin where he basically says, he wants German, he says, I fear German power less than I am beginning to fear German inactivity. And he's talking about the economic crisis. But if Poland is saying they're really not worried about Germany, then okay, we're doing all right. Okay, in the historical scope of things, this is progress. So the core European security dilemmas at the military level are managed. And an alignment probably, at least we certainly have a window of opportunity here where we can realign away from this. Now, what I'm recommending is 5 particular things be done, and this is where I'll transition out. So first of all, what I'm pushing for, and I don't know if it will succeed, but I'd like to see a very clear statement from the United States at the NATO summit in the spring, that over the next 2 to 3 years, America will work with its allies to help them develop the integrative capacity they need to simultaneously fight a Libya-style war and a Balkan-style peace operation without the United States. I think that's a reasonable objective. It doesn't mean it will ever happen, but it's a reasonable objective. And if you set that objective, you can start working towards it and give people something to do in that regard. Secondly, and this is where I get more controversial, that America's role in NATO over the next, that would be developed over the next half decade or so, would be uniquely limited to Article 5 collective defense missions. So basically, America's involvement in the alliance would be as a reserve power. We would be in the alliance, we would stay, we wouldn't leave. But if the allies want to do Article 4 operations, like a Libya war or a Balkans peace operation, we certainly won't stop them, we certainly will help them, but it will be Europe's decision whether they want to do these things, and we will be prepared to be there. But America's role would be the large-in strategic anchor of Article 5. Now, the reason that's important and controversial is because logic follows from this approach that you can then ask, well, how many troops do you need to accomplish that, right? It's always been the case. How many troops do you need to have credible Article 5 commitments to collective defense? And if you look at the security environment, the answer is that you need very few, I think. And the main thing I would push, I have a whole different briefing on this, and I'm very glad to talk in detail about it shortly, if you like, is that the missile defense architecture, which America is going to be able to provide, at least in the first 2 stages with theater missile defense, with regard to Iranian capabilities, is a very robust demonstration of how America can still fulfill its collective defense Article 5 commitments to the NATO treaty. This is probably the main Article 5 threat that would exist out there today. And America is doing, I think, a really good job, having realigned its systems from Poland and the Czech Republic to move down into the southeastern parts of Europe. The Bush plan for missile defense was a really, really bad idea. The Obama plan for missile defense is a reasonable approach that aligns actual threats with actual capabilities that exist, like Aegis cruisers and things like that. So that's significant because it means that would be our emphasis. But at the end of the day, you're not going to need 80,000 troops to run a missile defense system for Europe. So the question then is how much? And I would argue very, very few are going to be needed. I'm also arguing that, the last 2 points, that this also means that significant American bases in Europe can be closed and handed over. Now, we don't save a lot of money this way. Our costs of being in Europe are pretty low. Europeans offset the cost of our basing, and there are some critical bases that are very important, like some of the air bases in Italy. But I'm arguing, like, for example, EUCOM, which is the European command. We have the command that runs the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan are actually based in Florida, right? So, I can't see a strong argument that you couldn't do the same thing with EUCOM. That would be a symbolic shift, a symbolic move. The savings aren't going to be huge, except when you have a crisis. And suddenly it's not America that has to be there or make that choice whether we're going to be there, but it will be Europe. And Europe being responsible for its own backyard, effectively. Finally, just as kind of for the Brussels bureaucracy crowd, but basically what I'm arguing is that the NATO infrastructure funds would be used to pay for realignment costs, so the United States taxpayer does not have to pay for that. And that then, here's a key one for the EU, that there needs to be basically an audit of what are the things needed in the NATO international staff and determine what elements of the good things that multilateral security operations do, like socialization, information sharing, training, could be transferred to to the European Union, sorry, which is its area of interest. And because I think, so for example, NATO is getting involved in cyber security. That's a civilian issue at the end of the day in my mind, and that's something maybe where the EU would be better aligned in that regard, not necessarily the military. That's just one example, but I think there's a lot of issue areas we're actually seeing increasing duplication in new areas that really could be better handed off to another organization. Finally, and by the way, that might even include a big position like Supreme Allied Commander Europe. Perhaps that should be a European and not an American. So these are the kind of things that 2 years ago, if you said these things, we were talking about this earlier, this would be heresy, in a NATO conference. And I must admit, I don't get invited to many NATO conferences to make these arguments, but I do get invited to say them on National Public Radio and places like that. And it seems to have really shifted the debate. Not my contributions, but the debate and these experiences that I'm talking about here have shifted the thinking in Washington. And so I'm making a deductive logic as to where I think this heads. Now, why is it of interest to Ireland? Just give me 2 minutes and I'll be done. I think this is actually probably good news for Ireland. I don't think it affects too much what you do with your defense forces. You have incredibly capable people. You have an incredibly devoted staff and people that are doing great things in Lebanon and have done great things in other places. It's relatively small, and so I don't think that's going to affect the large integration of these missions. But I think it's good news because this shift really shows that the fundamental challenges that have to be addressed at the end of the day are economic. And the Eurozone really has to have the space to work on this. And so we can't be showing up and putting pressure on the European allies saying, you must do more, A, B, C, or D. Now, the flip side of that is, though, America often comes under kind of criticism for either doing too much in the world or not doing enough, and why are you in Libya but not in Syria? Europe, 60 years after World War II, is certainly capable of making those own judgments for itself with the support of the United States as our best friends and allies in the world. So it's kind of converse, but at the end of the day, I'm actually trying to make an argument to strengthen this relationship and redefine it in different ways. We know for sure, as Secretary of Defense Gates said, if we keep doing it like we've been doing it, it will fail. We know the current way hasn't worked. And I think the real question is, will we see kind of gradual incremental change, or will we actually grab the bull by the horns and make real policy? And will President Obama actually leave one of the most long-term positive effects on the transatlantic relationship by really making it a sustainable and durable one for the 21st century? So the trick is how to do this in a managed, careful way. I think we have the time to do it. I think it's the right move, in particular, given the nature of the crisis that is affecting everybody in the Eurozone. And that really has to be the priority at this stage. So I think that's a good place to stop. And now you can tell me why I'm wrong. So thank you for listening. I appreciate it.